In 1963, Ford tried to buy Ferrari. The deal was done. The contracts were printed. Then Enzo Ferrari looked Henry Ford II in the eye, insulted his company, insulted his family, and walked away. What happened next cost Ford hundreds of millions of dollars, rewrote the rules of international motorsport, and produced one of the greatest loopholes in racing history. A loophole so clever that Ferrari couldn't beat it, the governing body couldn't close it, and a 5-year-old car won Le Mans twice. So here's the setup. It's the early 1960s and Ford Motor Company has a problem. They're selling plenty of cars. Business is fine, but the brand is boring. General Motors has the Corvette. European manufacturers have mystique and racing pedigree. Ford has the Falcon. Reliable, affordable, practical. Everything a young buyer in 1962 did not want. A new generation was emerging. Post-war kids who'd grown up watching racing on television, who wanted speed and style and a little bit of danger in their driveways. The marketing guys at Ford understood this. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday. That was the mantra echoing through every executive corridor in Detroit. If your car won races, people bought the road version. Simple as that. And nobody won races like Ferrari. 6 consecutive victories at the 24 Hours of Le Mans from 1960 through 1965, the most prestigious endurance race on earth, and the prancing horse owned it completely. Enzo Ferrari didn't build road cars because he loved road cars. He built road cars because he needed money to go racing. The man's entire business model was essentially a very expensive hobby supported by a side hustle, selling hand-built sports cars to wealthy Europeans. But that side hustle was struggling. Ferrari's road car division was hemorrhaging cash. The cars were beautiful but expensive to produce, and Enzo had zero interest in streamlining production. Every lira that came in went straight to the racing team. By the early 60s, the company was in genuine financial trouble. Henry Ford II saw an opportunity. If Ford could buy Ferrari, they'd instantly have credibility in motorsport, a legendary brand to bolt onto the blue oval, and a shortcut into the European sports car market. Lee Iacocca, the marketing genius already developing what would become the Mustang, pushed the idea hard. Ford's board approved the approach, so Ford sent a delegation to Maranello. Phil Paradise, head of Ford's Italian operation, made the initial contact in May of 1963. The proposal was straightforward. 2 new companies would be formed. Ford-Ferrari would handle road cars, with Ford as majority stockholder. Ferrari-Ford would handle racing, with Enzo in control, but Ford retaining certain rights and oversight. Enzo seemed interested. Genuinely interested, according to Don Frey, the Ford division general manager who led the negotiations. Frey spent days in Modena, driving out to Maranello each morning. Ferrari rarely arrived before 10. It was usually after lunch before anything got done. Enzo was a night person. Negotiations ran past midnight. They discussed everything, logo designs, badge placement. Frey and Ferrari talked at length about the Indianapolis 500. Enzo had even designed engines for it. He was fascinated. The deal valued the company at roughly $18 million, months of meetings, teams of lawyers, asset specialists, manufacturing experts. Everything was agreed. The contracts were ready for signatures. And then Enzo read the fine print. There was a clause, a specific clause stipulating that Ferrari would need Ford's approval for any racing expenditure above a certain figure. According to Franco Gozzi, Enzo's personal secretary and confidant, this was the breaking point. After 22 days of negotiations, Ferrari told the Ford delegation that the clause seriously compromised the total freedom he'd been promised as racing team director. Then things got personal. The exact words vary by source, but the consensus is that Enzo called the company ugly, called Ford's cars ugly, and called the factory ugly. Several accounts suggest he told Henry Ford II that his grandfather had been a far superior man, that the real Henry Ford was dead, and what remained was a poor replacement. The Ford delegation flew home, empty-handed, humiliated, having spent months of executive time and substantial money on a deal that evaporated because a 70-year-old Italian refused to let anyone tell him how to spend money on race cars. To make it worse, many at Ford suspected the whole thing had been a negotiating tactic, that Enzo had used Ford's interest to drive up his price with Fiat, the Italian automotive giant that would eventually buy a 50% stake in Ferrari in 1969. Whether that was true or not, the perception alone was infuriating. Henry Ford II was not a man who took humiliation well. The unsigned purchase contract still sits in the Ford archives today, next to a confidential memo drafted weeks after the collapse. That memo outlines a new high-performance division and its first project, a racing GT car to compete at Sebring and Le Mans. The exact quote attributed to Ford varies by source, but the intent was unmistakable. Beat Ferrari, beat them at Le Mans, beat them on their own soil, spend whatever it takes. Ford threw everything at the problem. They partnered with Lola Cars in England, whose founder Eric Broadley had already designed a promising mid-engine sports racer called the Lola Mark VI. British engineer Roy Lunn was dispatched to the UK ex-Aston Martin team boss, John Wyer, was put in charge of a new facility in Slough called Ford Advanced Vehicles. The car they built was called the Ford GT. The nickname came from the car's height, 40 inches at the top of the windshield, GT40. The first version ran a 4.2-liter V8. It was quick. It could hit 200 miles per hour. It could also get airborne above 170. The aerodynamics were, to put it charitably, underdeveloped. Bruce McLaren had evaluated the prototype back in August of 1963. The team knew there were problems, but the timeline was brutal. The car debuted at the Nürburgring in May of 1964, then Le Mans, then Reims. Every single GT40 retired with mechanical failures. Not one finished. Ferrari won Le Mans again, 1-2-3. Ford's grand revenge had produced exactly 0 results and a lot of embarrassment. 1965 was marginally better, but still painful. Carroll Shelby, the Texas chicken farmer who'd become a Le Mans winning driver and then a car builder, was brought in to take over the racing program. Shelby was not a man who did things halfway. He replaced the 4.2-liter engine with a 7-liter big block Ford V8, the same basic architecture he'd used in the Cobra. The car won at the Daytona 2,000 kilometers. It took second at Sebring. Progress. Then Le Mans happened. 5 GT40s entered. Every single one broke down. Transmission failures, clutch problems, head gasket issues. The best one lasted 7 hours. Ferrari won again. That was their 6th straight Le Mans victory. 2 years into the program, hundreds of millions in today's money. And the Le Mans trophy was still sitting in Maranello. But Shelby's team kept pushing. Ken Miles, a British-born test driver and racer who understood cars at an almost molecular level, was instrumental in developing the Mark II version. The 7-liter engine was refined to produce around 550 brake horsepower, though Ford officially listed it at 485 to keep the sanctioning bodies comfortable. The brakes were improved. The cooling was sorted. The suspension was dialed in through thousands of miles of testing. Miles drove the car relentlessly, pushing it to destruction, learning from every failure, rebuilding, and going again. In 1966, Ford didn't just enter Le Mans, they overwhelmed it. 8 Mark IIs on the grid. Ferrari brought their new 330 P3 prototypes, but the numbers were against them. By the end of the 24 hours, every single Ferrari had retired, every one, and Ford's cars were running 1-2-3. Ken Miles had dominated. He'd been fastest throughout the race in the #1 car, sharing duties with Denny Hume. He'd already won Daytona and Sebring that year. A victory at Le Mans would have made him the first driver in history to win the Triple Crown of endurance racing in a single season. Ford's executives wanted something different. They wanted a photo finish. 3 cars crossing the line together, side by side, a marketing image for the ages. Leo Beebe, Ford's racing coordinator, ordered Miles to slow down and wait for the other 2 cars to catch up. Miles did as he was told. The 3 Ford GT40s crossed the line nearly together. But the rules had a bitter surprise. The car driven by Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon had started further back on the grid. Under Le Mans timing rules, the car that covers the greater distance is the winner. McLaren and Amon had technically traveled further because of their starting position. Miles, the man who'd led the entire race, who'd been fastest at every stage, who'd followed team orders perfectly, was classified second. 2 months later, Ken Miles was testing the next evolution of the GT40, the J car, at Riverside Raceway in California. The car broke apart at high speed. Miles was killed. He was 47 years old. He never got the Le Mans victory he deserved, and the racing world lost one of its finest development drivers. Ford won Le Mans again in 1967 with the Mark IV, an entirely American-designed and American-built evolution driven by Dan Gurney and A.J. Foyt. It remains the only all-American victory in Le Mans history. American drivers, American team, American chassis, American engine, American tires. Nobody's matched it since. After they crossed the line, Gurney sprayed champagne on the assembled crowd. He's often credited with starting that tradition. 2 consecutive dominant victories. Ferrari humbled. Henry Ford II attended the '66 race personally. When his cars crossed the line, the man who'd been insulted by Enzo Ferrari 3 years earlier reportedly had tears in his eyes. Mission accomplished. Now. Here's where the loophole comes in. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. Okay, back to it. Ford had crushed Le Mans with 7-liter engines. The speeds were staggering. GT40s had been clocked at over 210 miles per hour on the Mulsanne Straight. The FIA's regulatory arm, the Commission Sportive Internationale, got nervous. The memory of the 1955 Le Mans disaster, which killed over 80 spectators, still haunted the sport. These cars were reaching speeds the circuits were never designed for. So the CSI changed the rules for 1968. Prototype racing cars in Group 6 would be limited to 3-liter engines, 3 liters. Ford had been running 7. Ferrari's P4 used a 4-liter V12. Chaparral's Monsters were gone too. The era of the big-engine prototypes was officially over. But there was a second category, Group 4 sports cars. And this is the part that changes everything. If a manufacturer could demonstrate that they'd built at least 50 examples of a car, that car could be classified as a production sports car rather than a prototype. Production sports cars were allowed engines up to 5 liters, still limited, but far more than 3. The thinking was straightforward. Real road cars that happened to go racing should have larger engines than purpose-built prototypes. The intent was to encourage actual production vehicles and limit the most extreme machines. What the rule actually created was a loophole the size of the Mulsanne Straight. Ford had already done the work. Back in 1965, Ford Advanced Vehicles produced enough road-legal GT40 Mark Is to clear the homologation threshold. Some had quieter exhausts, slightly softer suspension, marginally more civilized interiors. At 40 inches tall with a mid-mounted V8 inches from your spine, civilized is a generous term. But they met the legal definition. Around 105 GT40s were produced total, and at least 50 Mark Is were built, comfortably clearing the minimum. When the new rules dropped, Ford applied for Group 4 homologation. The GT40 Mark I, they argued, was a production sports car. It met the quantity requirement. Its engine was under 5 liters. Homologation was approved in February of 1966 and remained valid through 1971. Some modifications were permitted in early '68, including updates to the cylinder head, a bored-out engine of 4,942 cubic centimeters, and an improved gearbox with a limited slip differential. Ferrari was apoplectic. Enzo had canceled his entire prototype program in protest of the rule changes. He understood perfectly that a 5-liter sports car would demolish any 3-liter prototype on a long straight. But Ferrari couldn't meet the 50-car requirement. The P4 was a hand-built racing machine. A dozen existed maybe, nowhere close to 50. Getting there would require fundamentally changing what Ferrari was. And Enzo would sooner shut down than become a volume manufacturer. The FIA examined Ford's application, accepted it, and dismissed Ferrari's protest. The GT40 Mark I was officially a Group 4 production sports car. Enter John Wyer. Again, Wyer had been with the GT40 from day one. After Ford's factory teams withdrew following 1967, he bought the racing rights and formed JW Automotive Engineering, securing backing from Gulf Oil. The resulting livery, sky blue and orange, would become the most recognizable paint scheme in motorsport history. Wyer's team took the Mark I and addressed every known weakness with surgical precision. Start with the engine. The original 4.7-liter Ford V8 was a solid unit, derived from the small block that powered everything from Mustangs to pickup trucks. But in endurance race trim, it had one persistent flaw: head gaskets. The block and head expanded at different rates under sustained heat, and over 24 hours of continuous operation, the gasket would fail. Wyer's engineers came up with an elegantly simple fix. They bored the engine to 4.9 liters, giving it 4,942 cubic centimeters, and cut O-rings into channels between the block and head. Those O-rings maintained the seal regardless of thermal expansion. Problem solved. The engine now made around 415 brake horsepower. For context, the 7-liter Mark II had made 550. The Mark I was giving up well over 100 horsepower compared to its big block predecessor, but it could run all day and all night without cooking itself. The chassis was a steel semi-monocoque with front and rear subframes, double A-arm suspension up front, trailing links at the rear, ventilated disc brakes at each corner, a ZF 5-speed manual feeding a limited slip differential. None of this was revolutionary. What was revolutionary was the weight savings. Body panels were carbon fiber composite, a material most teams wouldn't touch for another decade. Magnesium replaced heavier metals in the suspension. The doors had large openings for quick driver changes with sliding plastic windows. Every gram mattered over 24 hours. Aerodynamic data from the failed Mirage prototype was applied to the Mark I's bodywork. The Mirage had been Wyer's attempt at a proper Group 6 successor. It never worked as a race car, but the aero lessons transferred well. The GT40's profile was distinctive, 40 inches tall, low, wide, aggressive, enough downforce to stay planted through fast corners without killing straight-line speed. And then there was the lighting. Wyer's team had partnered with an American company called Sylvania, specialists in automotive illumination. They modified the GT40's headlamps to give vastly superior straight-line range on the main beams and widespread on the supplementary lamps for corner illumination. At Le Mans, where you race through the night, being able to see further and more clearly than your competition is worth seconds per lap. Over a full night stint, that adds up. The 3-liter prototypes it faced were quick but fragile. Porsche's 908 was fast but still sorting reliability issues. Alfa Romeo's prototypes were elegant but inconsistent. The Alpine and Matra entries showed promise but lacked the GT40's one unbeatable advantage: the thing simply would not break. The 1968 Le Mans was postponed from June to late September because of the massive social upheaval sweeping France. It rained heavily. Ferrari boycotted the event entirely, Enzo still furious. Ford even volunteered to fund a chicane on the main straight to reduce speeds, the first significant circuit modification since 1932. Wyre's top drivers, Jacky Ickx and Brian Redman, were both injured from Formula One accidents. So Pedro Rodriguez and Lucien Bianchi took the wheel of chassis 1075. Rodriguez had tried Le Mans 10 times before and finished once. Bianchi was on his 13th attempt. They won by 5 laps. Comfortable, commanding. A 4-year-old design beating factory 3-liter prototypes from Porsche, Alfa, and everyone else. The GT40 won enough championship rounds to deliver Ford the 1968 International Championship for Makes, with a privateer team, through a production loophole. But the truly extraordinary chapter was 1969. Porsche learned from Ford's playbook immediately. When the FIA lowered the Group 4 production minimum to 25 cars, Porsche secretly built exactly 25 Porsche 917s, a 4.5-liter flat 12 producing around 580 horsepower in a car barely weighing 1,800 pounds. It was the fastest thing anyone had ever seen at Le Mans. It was also nearly undrivable. Most experienced drivers preferred the older, tamer 908. Porsche had already clinched the World Championship before Le Mans. They entered 16 cars, more than a third of the field. They were overwhelming favorites. Wyre brought 2 GT40s. One was chassis 1075, the same car that won the year before. They called it the Old Lady. On paper, the power-to-weight numbers were laughable. The GT40 was at 5.18 pounds per horsepower. The Porsche 908 was 4.27. This should not have been competitive. The race began with a protest. The traditional Le Mans start required drivers to sprint across the track to their cars, jump in, and go. Willie Maires had been severely burned the previous year, partly because he hadn't fastened his harness in the sprint. John Wolfe, a 917 privateer, would be killed on the opening lap of this very race in a car he barely knew how to drive. Jacky Ickx refused to run. He walked. Slowly. Got in the car. Buckled every strap. Started the engine. Pulled away, dead last. It was the last year of the Le Mans-style start. The Wyre team's strategy was patience. David York, the team manager, set a comfortable target lap time during practice. The drivers were instructed to hit that time and not push harder. Not by a second. The instruction was simple: survive until dawn on Sunday. If the car is still running at daybreak, you have 12 hours to worry about winning. Wyre himself had a philosophy about Le Mans. He didn't believe in pre-race heroics. He believed in pit work, reliability, and discipline. The Gulf team's pit stops were rehearsed to the second. Every driver change, every refueling, every brake pad swap was choreographed. Wyre ran his operation like a military campaign while other teams improvised. The second Wyre GT40 was driven by David Hobbs and Mike Halewood, the motorcycle racing legend who'd crossed over to cars. Their job was partly strategic. If the lead car got into trouble, the second car was there to interfere with competitors. Halewood would spend the closing stages of the race in a fierce battle with a Matra prototype, keeping it from challenging for the podium. His contribution rarely gets mentioned. It should. Porsche led for roughly 90% of the race, but the 917s kept breaking. Gearbox failures, oil leaks. The leading car, driven by Vic Elford and Richard Atwood, had its gearbox fail with 3 hours to go. Suddenly, impossibly, the Old Lady led the race, but Hans Herrmann's Porsche 908 was right there, same lap, 10 seconds back. The Porsche had fading brakes and reduced engine power. The Ford had exhaust problems, sapping performance. 2 wounded cars, perfectly matched with 3 hours to settle it. For those final hours, the lead changed on almost every lap. Ickx worked out the geometry. The Mulsanne Straight was 5 kilometers long. If he led into it, Herrmann would use superior straight-line speed to pass. But by slipstreaming behind the Porsche all the way down, Ickx could outbrake Herrmann at the corner, then hold the lead through the twisty sections where the GT40's stability was superior. The final lap was pure chess. The cars crossed the line with less than a minute on the clock. One more lap required. The GT40 had only managed 23 laps on a tank of fuel. This was lap 24, nearly empty. Ickx faked fuel starvation. He let Herrmann pass early on the straight, the Ford appearing to stumble. Herrmann took the bait. Ickx tucked into the slipstream, conserving his last drops of fuel behind the Porsche's body. At the end of the straight, he slingshot past, held on through the corners, crossed the line about 120 meters ahead. 390 feet, after 372 laps, the closest finish in Le Mans history. The same chassis. 1075. The old lady. Back-to-back wins. The last time one car did that was a Bentley in 1929 and 30. Ickx dedicated the victory to Lucien Bianchi, killed earlier that year. Think about the full arc. The FIA changed the rules to end Ford's dominance. The rules had a gap. Ford had accidentally filled that gap years earlier by building road cars. Ferrari couldn't exploit the same gap because building cars in volume was antithetical to everything Enzo believed. The very exclusivity that defined Ferrari made them ineligible. And the deeper irony. Ford's own success triggered the rule change. The rule change created the loophole. The loophole worked because of throwaway road cars nobody at Ford thought twice about in 1965. Those afterthought cars turned out to be the key to 2 more years of domination. The GT40's competitive life ended after '69. Porsche sorted the 917 and dominated the '70s. Ford moved on. But here's the thing that makes the loophole story even more remarkable. Ford actually tried to build a proper replacement for the GT40 in the 3-liter prototype class. They commissioned Alan Mann Racing to design a car around the Cosworth DFV Formula One engine. The result was the Ford P68. Beautiful, low, curvaceous. In testing, it hit 217 miles per hour. It never finished a race, not once. Across 2 full seasons, every P68 retired. Aerodynamic instability, engine failures, overheating. Ford pulled the plug without ever competing at Le Mans with it. So the high-tech 3-liter prototype was a total failure, while a 5-year-old production car with a modified truck engine kept winning the biggest race in the world. That tells you everything about endurance racing. It also explains why the loophole mattered. Without it, Ford had nothing. The GT40 wasn't Plan B. It was the only plan that worked. The legacy reshaped motorsport permanently. Building just enough road cars to homologate a racer became the standard playbook. Porsche copied it with the 917. Ferrari eventually learned too, homologating the 512S for 70, though by then Porsche owned the class. The concept evolved through the decades. The Lancia Stratos in rallying, the BMW M1, the Porsche 959 and Ferrari F40, the McLaren F1, the Porsche 911 GT1, the Mercedes CLK GTR in the 90s. Every hypercar built to satisfy a racing regulation traces its lineage to those GT40s from Slough. There's a footnote worth mentioning. After Wired denied Porsche their first Le Mans victory with a Ford, Porsche approached him about running their factory team for 70 and 71. He accepted. The man who beat them became their team boss. Motorsport has a dark sense of humor. Surviving originals sell for $3 to $10 million. A 64 prototype fetched over $7.5 million in 2020. A never-raced Mark II lightweight sold for over $12 million. The GT40 name itself became a legal curiosity. Ford never trademarked it. When they wanted to call the modern car GT40 in the early 2000s, someone else owned the rights, so it became the Ford GT. The 2004 version was a deliberate homage. Mid-engine, low roofline, supercharged V8. It existed because of what the original did. The 2016 car was more ambitious. Twin-turbo V6, carbon fiber chassis. Ford returned to Le Mans on the 50th anniversary and won GTE Pro. Some grudges live in the corporate DNA. The 2019 film brought the story to millions who'd never heard of Le Mans. It focused on 66 and the injustice done to Miles. It didn't cover the loophole years. Maybe it should have. Beating Ferrari with overwhelming resources is impressive. Beating the rules with cleverness and a car everyone had written off is something else. Enzo never sold the racing team, not to Ford, not to Fiat. He ran Scuderia Ferrari until he died in 1988 at 90 years old. The man who torpedoed the biggest deal in automotive history did it to keep control of the thing he loved most, stubborn or principled. Either way, it created one of the greatest rivalries in motorsport, and a car that beat the rules, beat the odds, and beat everything on the track for 4 consecutive years. The GT40 didn't just outsmart Ferrari, it outsmarted the entire system. And it did it with a car that was already supposed to be obsolete, running on fumes driven by a man who refused to sprint to the starting line. And there you have it. The Ford GT40, born from a grudge, perfected through failure, and kept alive by a loophole the rule book never saw coming. If you think I missed something, or you've seen one in person, let me know in the comments. And if you made it this far, subscribe. We do this every week.